In today's program, Thai media organizations call on the government to abide by a civil court ruling not to crack down on news that they claim could create public fear. Meanwhile, Chulalongkorn University closes its application round for volunteers for its new mRNA vaccine testing, and His Majesty the King has weighed in to offer help for students who have lost their parents or caretakers to COVID-19. More on these hopeful stories coming up in today's program. You're watching Thailand News Today, bringing you the latest top stories in Thailand. In our first story, officials in Phuket are pulling out all stops in a bid to restore tourist confidence following the murder of a 57-year-old Swiss national last week. The victim, who had been visiting Phuket under the island's Sandbox scheme, was found dead at Ao Yon waterfall on Cape Banwa last Thursday. The murder, along with the worldwide media coverage, has left local authorities and tourism operators anxious about the fate of the island's reopening scheme. The arrival numbers were already on the wane as a result of the added restrictions, the virtual sealing off of the island's road access from the mainland, and only a handful of flights servicing domestic routes. In a rush to protect the island's reputation, police managed to find the murder suspect just 2 days after the discovery of the victim's body. A 27-year-old Talang resident, Thirawat Thawtip, was arrested and has allegedly confessed to murdering Ms. Salvan Weiskopf. But despite the swift arrest and confession, concerns remain that the incident, which has been widely reported internationally, will harm the island's reputation and jeopardize the Sandbox scheme. Phuket Governor Narong Wunsiu has vowed to increase security for visitors to the island, although the actual numbers of tourists on the island is currently a tiny fraction of the million or so that used to arrive in pre-COVID times. Meanwhile, the CCSA announced 82 new infections in Phuket over the past 24 hours. Following a civil court ruling against Prime Minister General Prayut Chan-o-cha, Thai media organizations are calling on the government to abide by the court's decision. Last Friday, the court ruled that the Prime Minister had overstepped his authority in banning the dissemination of news that he claimed could create public fear. In its ruling, the court found that the ban was too vague and therefore an infringement of people's rights and freedoms. The court was responding to a petition from 12 online media organizations and human rights lawyers who accused the Prime Minister of threatening the accuracy of media reporting and freedom of speech. In response to the ruling, 6 media organizations are urging the government to comply with the court's order. The National Press Council of Thailand, the News Broadcasting Council of Thailand, the Thai Journalists Association, the Thai Broadcast Journalists Association, the Online News Providers Association, and the National Union of Journalists of Thailand say the government must also consider if other regulations implemented during the COVID-19 crisis might also infringe on free speech. Deputy Prime Minister Wisanu Krungam says the government will comply with the court's ruling, but refused to admit if the Prime Minister's attempt to introduce the ban was a misstep. Prodemocracy activist Parit Chiwarak, who's also known by his nickname Penguin, has been rearrested and imprisoned ahead of another anti-government rally tomorrow. Parit was detained on his arrival at the Royal Thai Police headquarters yesterday, following a summons issued on August 2nd. Parit faces charges related to graffiti that appeared outside a police office in the central province of Pathum Thani. It's understood that the activist had appeared at the station to demand the release of fellow activists. Police have also arrested 14 other activists who face charges related to the violence at Saturday's anti-government protests in Bangkok. The protests turned ugly when police used rubber bullets and water cannons to impede the progress of the protesters. According to the Metropolitan Police Bureau, 4 of the 14 suspects arrested have been charged with arson and causing injury to police officers. 3 officers were injured during a clash at the Dindang intersection in Bangkok, with 1 officer still in intensive care after he was allegedly shot in the back of his neck. Protesters also set fire to a police truck and damaged a police booth. The Free Youth protest group gloated about the truck fire on Instagram the same day, but following criticism of the action, the post was later edited. Tomorrow's rally is scheduled to be held at Bangkok's Ratchaprasong intersection. The Faculty of Medicine at Bangkok's Chulalongkorn University has closed volunteer applications for its locally developed COVID-19 vaccine trials, as enough people have already signed up. The Chula Vaccine Research Center closed applications ahead of schedule, as it already has enough volunteers. The Thai vaccine candidate, named Chula COVID-19, is an mRNA vaccine which is expected to begin second phase trials by the end of this month. Pfizer and Moderna are also mRNA technology vaccines. Participants in the trials had to be between the ages of 56 and 75 with no underlying health conditions. They must also have never contracted COVID-19 or been vaccinated against the virus. Volunteers who pass the initial screening stage will be contacted by August the 15th. The vaccine is being developed with the support of the U.S. academic who invented mRNA technology. Professor Drew Wiseman from the University of Pennsylvania developed the vaccine from COVID-19's genetic material. The technology works by prompting the body to create spike proteins, which stimulate the immune system to fight the virus. Chula COVID-19 trials have already proved successful on monkeys and mice, followed by a first phase of human trials on June the 14th. The second phase is expected to begin by the end of the month. His Majesty the King has weighed in to offer help for students who have lost their parents or caretakers to COVID-19. The Ministry of Social Development and Human Security has initially reported 35 children whose parents have died during the pandemic. The number is expected to increase, and the ministry is preparing long-term measures to help these orphans. His Majesty has offered to have these students educated under royal patronage. They will receive the highest standard of education free of charge, according to the announcement. The ministry will be in charge of coordinating the children's scholarships and finding a foster family if needed, with financial support until their graduation. Meanwhile, the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration has set up the first community isolation center for children aged 3 to 14 years affected by fallout from the pandemic in Thailand at the Sports and Recreation Center in Dusit District. A new report from the World Wildlife Fund says Thailand's progress in doubling its wild Indo-Chinese tiger population by 2022 could be better. However, the findings are contradicted by the Department of National Parks, Wildlife and Plant Conservation, which claimed last week that numbers have gone up from 166 in 2020 to 177 this year, and that this staff are committed to doubling the numbers by next year. Thung Yai Hoi Kha Keng Wildlife Sanctuary, a World Heritage listed site in the west of the country, is home to 89 tigers, up from 42 in 2010, according to the official stats. In the east of the country, Dong Phaya Yen Khao Yai Forest Complex is home to 22 tigers, where there were just 8 in 2010. Officials also plan to increase wild tiger numbers in the Gengrajan Forest Complex in the western province of Phetchaburi. However, according to the Wildlife Conservation Office, a plan to create a series of wildlife corridors linking the complex to other reserves in the area has been put on the back burner due to the presence of indigenous communities living in the area. The complex was recently given World Heritage status despite objections from the ethnic Karen population who live there. Residents accuse the government of violating their human rights, and the World Heritage Committee has ordered the government to better engage with the local population in efforts to preserve the area. Meanwhile, the WWF report says snares are some of the biggest threats to tigers in Southeast Asia, along with habitat loss as a result of development, illegal logging, and agriculture expansion, and the illegal trade in tigers and tiger parts. And that's all the news we have for you in this program, but don't forget to subscribe to the channel and keep that notification bell on to stay on top of the latest stories in Thailand. Meanwhile, you are up to date on the Thaiger. สวัสดีครับ